I think one of the universal realities for all of us in life, and what I've had the privilege of spending significant time walking with many of you through, is those moments in life that become either deal breakers or game changers. Deal breakers or game changers. And those situations happen to us in different seasons of life. Sometimes they come because of the onset of a significant illness, maybe a terminal diagnosis, maybe the tragic loss of a loved one, and it was sudden and it was catastrophic. Maybe it was just financial setbacks or job situations, major conflict in a marriage, disconnect with our children. There's a variety of moments in life that as we're experiencing them, that we have to come to grips with the reality that this is either going to be a deal breaker for us, that I can't trust God anymore, that I'm not willing to continue to believe that He is good and He is gracious and He is kind and the trust in His character, or it becomes a game changer, which means I have to change my lens on who I thought God was and come to grips with who He now is and allow it to transform me so that I can learn to trust Him more, because indeed God is very different than we expect Him to be. And we experience those moments in life, for some of us, many times over. For others of us, maybe it's just a few major moments. But the real question is, what do we do? And what determines whether or not it becomes a deal breaker or it becomes a game changer? What's the difference? And why is it that some people can face the exact same circumstances, and for some it becomes a deal breaker and they throw up their hands and say, I'm done, I'm mad at God, I don't want to trust Him anymore, I don't want anything to do with this anymore. And for others it becomes a game changer where it radically changes them so that they become the kind of person that's able to bless and to love others well, and it with others, with God, and ultimately with themselves. For some, it's a deal breaker. For others, it's a game changer. What makes the difference? We're continuing through this series, and we'll take this through into Easter. We've just called it urgent because there's this study that Mark has offered us as he has laid out through his own experience, but more specifically through the eyes of Peter, as he's identified this suffering Messiah that came that was so radically different than what everybody expected Him to be. And in the midst of his presentation, there's an urgency. There's a sense in which you have to do something with this Messiah. This is, I think, one of the weirdest aspects of modern Christianity in America, and that is that we treat Jesus as something that is able to be appreciated, maybe respected, maybe valued, but we don't have to really do anything with Him. He just becomes a sidebar background figure. And Mark's presentation, and throughout the Gospels, we see it this way. You either have to acknowledge that Jesus is who He declares Himself to be and has offered us access to God in a very specific way, or you have to see Him as somebody who was a lunatic, a liar, or at least somebody who is not worthy of any attention or appreciation whatsoever. Mark is saying there's an urgency to this, and he wants to capture our attention around it. In fact, the original audience he was writing to, he was trying to say, if you understand who this Jesus is, you will have hope in the midst of some really dire circumstances, as they were experiencing significant persecution in Rome. So we're going to jump back into the text, and we're going to work through Mark chapter 8, verse 27 through Mark 9, and we're going to see, I think, two different major things. I loved what Michael did last week is he walked us through kind of comparing two different dinners, right? Herod's dinner and the debauchery and all of the craziness going on there versus the meal that Jesus offered of the feeding of the thousands and thousands and what He offered in the midst of the heartbreak that He was experiencing. And I so appreciated that juxtaposition of understanding who Jesus is in the face of significant turmoil. So we're going to pick this up. It says this in verse 27 of chapter 8. Jesus and His disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. Now they had been in Bethsaida. There has been miracles that were going on there. And so now they've traveled about 50 miles to Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was a pretty interesting environment where there were lots of temples and lots of statues of gods to be worshipped. But specifically, Caesarea Philippi was believed to be the birthplace for the Greco-Roman god Pan. And there was a temple there where people participated in lots of really illicit, pretty despicable acts in worship of Pan. And there was a cave there where a lot of sacrifices to this god Pan was made. And it was believed that that cave was the opening and the entry point for the underworld, or specifically Hades, which gives us a little bit of context for how Jesus responds, and Matthew's rendering of this, of how Jesus responds when he says that the gates of Hades will not prevail against the church that I'm going to build. It was in Caesarea Philippi where he makes that statement. But they go to Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, he asks them, "Who do you say that I am?" Disciples, they replied, "Some say you're John the Baptist. You're the reincarnation of John the Baptist, that you're still out there proclaiming this news of this coming Messiah. Others say that you're Elijah, you're one of the prophets, and you've come back again to just proclaim, bring prophecy about what is to come. And still others, one of the other prophets. But what about you," he asked, "who do you say that I am?" And Peter, ever the bold one, jumps out and says, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. He says, "You are the Messiah. You are the promised one. You are the one that we have been waiting for, longing for, expecting, hoping for." See, I think it could be said this way. In leadership circles, there's this phrase that gets used, and it says this: the world we make for ourselves may be determined by the answers that we ask. That we actually define the kind of world that we live in by the questions that we ask. I think that's a provocative statement, that if we ask better questions, we're able to formulate better answers, and so we're able to orchestrate better things in our world around us. I think that's an interesting way of thinking about leadership. Well, here's what I would say. The world we make for ourselves may be determined by the questions we ask, but our destiny, where we'll spend eternity, and ultimately the trajectory of our lives is defined by how we answer one question. And that is, who is Jesus? Who do you say that I am? Who is Jesus? How we answer the question, who is Jesus, ultimately will define where we spend eternity, and it defines the trajectory of where we go with our lives. And so we may be able to craft a different kind of world by asking better questions, and I'm all for helping people ask better questions, because I think a lot of the questions we ask are pretty silly, by the way. Because when we're in the face of adversity, we're going, how do I get out of this adversity, rather than how do I learn from this adversity? But when we're in conflict with another person, we're saying, how do I convince them that they're wrong, rather than asking, what is my part in this, and what do I need to change to make it better? We ask foolish questions, and so I would say that we need to ask better questions. But at the end of the day, none of that is nearly as important as how we answer the question, who is Jesus? Is he just another good teacher? Is he just another individual that we can learn from and appreciate his message about justice and loving one another? Or is he indeed who he says he was, which is he is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and he is one with God. And if we've seen him, we've seen the Father, and nobody comes to the Father except through him. Ultimately, our destiny is determined by who it is that we believe Jesus to be. And Jesus continues, and he says this: "He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things." And this statement, now we're initiating something new. Up until this section of the text, there's this presentation that Mark's been making about this Jesus who's uniquely different, but he's powerful, and he's orchestrating things, and he's able to have power over nature and over sickness, and he's proclaiming certain things about himself. But now there's something new that Jesus is laying on the table. He's showcasing, he's offering something different about him. And he says that the Son of Man must suffer. This Son of Man phraseology, we kind of pick it up as well. It's the Son of Man, so it's a human statement. Actually, Jesus is referencing something very different. He's going back to Daniel, where there's this, in the midst of the prophecy that Daniel was offering, in the midst of the exile that the Israelites were experiencing, he's going back, and there's this phraseology in Daniel chapter 7 that there was one like the Son of Man who was a divinic figure who was going to come with the angels and make everything right. And there was this promise that the Son of Man was going to come and finally was going to make things right, and he was going to be the deliverer of the nation of Israel. And that somehow this Son of Man was going to come, and he was going to impose his will, and he was going to be the great protector and the Savior for the Israelites. But Jesus says, indeed, I am the Son of Man. But then he says, but the Son of Man must suffer. And There was no context for the Son of Man, this prophetic figure who was going to come and make things right, who was going to conquer, liberate, become proclaimed as victor. There was no place for the Son of Man that was going to suffer. He was supposed to come and impose his will. And Jesus says, I am indeed the Son of Man. I'm the promised one from Daniel, but I am not who you think that I am. I have come, and I will be rejected, and ultimately I will be put to death. And he repeats this phraseology, he repeats this teaching 3 different times. Here, then later in chapter 9, verses 30 to 37, and then again in chapter 10, verses 32 to 45, culminating that entire section of teaching about the Son of Man suffering and being persecuted and dying and rising again. And he says it this way in verse 45 of chapter 10, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is who the Son of Man is. He's not the one that you think that he is, at least not now he's not. Now, in the way that I've come with a very different mission, with a different way of operating. Again, this whole idea of, is Jesus who we think that he is, and he is going to operate and act the way that we think that he should? Is that a game changer for us, or is that a deal breaker for us? And I've said this over and over again from the front, and this is not a good part of my character, but I will say it this way: after 27 years of pastoral ministry and after so many different seasons where it makes no sense to me why God operates the way he does, there's been moments where I've asked the question, is this a deal breaker for me? Why would you do this? Why would you operate like that? Why can't you just do it the way that it would make the most sense? Why can't you do it in the way that it would seem like it would alleviate more suffering? Why would you allow for these things to happen? And over again, there's moments where I'm asking, is this a deal breaker for me? I've had moments where my wife grabs my hand and says, are we okay? Are you okay? And I would say, yeah, I'm okay, but God and I aren't right now. Because I'm wrestling with that. Is this a deal breaker? Is this a game changer? Am I going to learn to trust him more? Am I going to let this shape me? Or am I going to allow this to be the thing that says, you know what, I don't know that I can do this anymore. He says he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. You get a sense that the disciples were so preoccupied with the whole suffering and being killed thing that they weren't listening to the rise again piece. They weren't listening to the hope in the midst of that. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Can I be gentle in how I say this to you? But can I invite you to consider something? If those moments where God lets you down and where he doesn't meet your expectations become a deal breaker for you, I wonder if Jesus would say something similar. You don't have in mind the things of God, you have only merely human concerns. Is it possible that you have a lens that you don't see big enough, that you don't see broad enough, that you can't see far enough, and that you're allowing your finite lens and your own sense of what should be to define reality for you? Jesus is saying to Peter, who did not have a category for the Son of Man being put to death, "Get behind me, because you do not have in mind the things of God. You only have in mind the things of man." If we're honest with each other, when those moments become deal breakers for us, the reality is it's because we're not willing to trust that God is different from us, and that his ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts, and that he's doing something in the midst of this that I may not have a context for, and I may not be able to come up with a reason for, but it may be my limitations, not his, that's creating that gap. He goes on in verse 34. Then he called the crowd to him. So Jesus is having this private conversation with his disciples. And then he pulls the crowd together. And what he's about to lay out for the crowd that who have seen the miracles and seen the powerful teaching and have heard him speak with great authority, now what he's about to lay out for them, I'll be honest with you, for many of them it became a deal breaker. For many of them, what he's about to say, this is where they're like, I don't want to do this. John chapter 6, one of the teachings that Jesus is giving, similar to what he's about to say, we're told in John chapter 6 that many left him at this time because what he was teaching was unacceptable to them. He says it this way in verse 34. Then he called the crowd together, and he says this, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." You're the revolutionary who's going to step into and be the insurrectionist that's going to take Rome back. You're going to allow us the opportunity to come and finally be liberated from this oppressor. We're not taking up crosses, we're taking up arms. We're trying to build an army here, Jesus. And he's going, here's the deal. If you want to follow me, you got to take up your cross and follow me. What does it look like to take up my cross and follow you? What is that thing that I'm most afraid of losing in life? What is that thing that I fantasize most about what I want and what I crave and that would most satisfy me in life? Am I willing to trust him if I lose that thing I'm terrified of losing? Am I willing to trust him if I never get the thing that I'm so anticipating finally having that will offer me fulfillment in life? To take up my cross. And I believe that this looks different for all of us. For some of us, it's that there's this fear that I'm never going to have sexual satisfaction in my life if I'm willing to be obedient to him and his call in my life. For some of us, it's going to be that I'm going to be tormented by things that I'm never going to be able to be set fully free from simply because he's allowing me to experience this so that I can trust him and so that my life can be a testimony of his work in my life. For some of us, that taking up my cross is a willingness to forgive someone who has violated me so deeply that it makes no sense, humanly speaking, that I would ever forgive them. Every one of us, it's taking up my cross to follow him. And he says, here's the deal. If you're going to follow after me, I'm taking up my cross. You got to follow me with your cross. He says, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? And he said to them, truly I tell you, some of you who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God has come with power. He tells the 12 that it was going to, the cost that it was going to be for him to be their Messiah. And then he turns to the crowd and he tells the crowd what it's going to cost them to follow him as their Messiah. His cross will lead to their crosses. The loss of his life will lead to their lives being offered up for him for the sake of the gospel. He's going to turn the world upside down in ways that we are still trying to make sense out of today. We will save our lives by losing our life. Jesus places the value of a single soul above the worth of the whole world. And Jesus says, this is what it takes to follow me. In fact, he said it this way. He made it clear that he indeed is a king, but a king who is going to a cross. And if we want to be a part of his kingdom, we have to be willing to carry our own cross. He's a king, and the king that's going to go to a cross, which makes no sense. A king that's going to rule and have a kingdom doesn't go to a cross. He puts people on a cross. And he says, I'm going to go to a cross, and I'm going to ask you to take up your own cross. To give up whatever it is that you think is going to be the most satisfying thing in this world. And while I'm going to bring satisfaction into your life, you've got to trust me to do it in the way that I will do it, because you can't do it in a way that's going to be honoring to me if you pursue it on your own. This is one of the hardest things about the Christian life, is that what I'm choosing is to say, God, I'm willing to pursue the greatest desires of my heart in a way that is honoring to you, not in a way that's just going to satiate those things in whatever way I choose to. Which usually means it's a couple of things. Number one, it's usually delayed. Number two, it's usually incomplete. And number three, it's usually sacrificial. It's usually not the timing that I want it to be. It's usually not going to be fully satisfied the way that I want it to. And many authors have said it this way: it's that dissatisfaction that tells me that there's something better on the other side of eternity. Because if I could be fully satisfied on this side of eternity, why do I need the next life? And ultimately, there's a sacrifice. I've got to give something up in pursuit of that. Jesus made it clear that he indeed is a king. But he's a king who's going to a cross. And that his kingdom is unlike any other kingdom. Because if we're going to be part of his kingdom, it's not as powerful rulers. It's as sacrificial servants that are taking our cross to follow him. C.S. Lewis was reflecting on this very specific text in Mark 8, and he said it this way. In his reflections, he said this: give up yourself, and you will find your real self. Lose your life, and you will save it. Submit to death, the death of your ambitions and favorite wishes every day,
and the death of your whole body in the end. Submit with every fiber of your being, and you will find eternal life. Keep back nothing. Nothing that you have not given away will be really yours. Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him everything else thrown in. There's just a different order to this. And here's the deal. There's something in our hearts that know that I can't satiate my desires anyway. Go have the greatest meal you've ever had in your life. You're still going to be hungry tomorrow. Go have the greatest sexual encounter you can possibly imagine having. That desire doesn't go away later. You can't satiate those desires. In fact, the proverb says that it's the desires of a man's heart that are never fully and completely satisfied. There's never going to be full satiation of that. So we can try to do that, or we can decide to pursue Christ and allow him to be the one that satisfies us. And it's going to be different, and it's maybe going to be delayed, and it's going to be sacrificial, but it's going to be far more fulfilling than anything we can go get on our own. So the question is it a game changer or is it a deal breaker? If he's forcing me to wait, if he's allowing me to experience something that doesn't make any sense, if there's this heartbreak that I'm going through, am I willing to trust that he's trying to change and reshape me so that I can experience something better that he has for me, rather than just go pursue it the way that I think is most easily accessible to me? I would say it this way. If you think about the way that Jesus taught about being a king going to the cross, I think one of the greatest obstacles for modern Christian Christ followers in America is that taking up their cross like Jesus did. He took up his cross not in it to win it. That he wasn't in it to go impose his will. He wasn't in it to go establish something that was going to be self-aggrandizing. He wasn't in it to go somehow achieve something that allowed for his name to be renowned in the way that we would typically see it, by power being taken and the political maneuverings that we see in our world. Jesus wasn't in it to win it. In fact, it was the exact opposite. He won us by going to the cross and giving himself up for us. He wasn't in it to win it. And we don't understand what to do with that. We've been so steeped in power and authority and might makes right, and somehow we have to win it so that we can somehow establish it, because that's how Jesus is glorified. It's like, that's not who Jesus is. That's not how Rome was dealt with after 300 years, when Christ followers who were not in it to win it just loved people well and followed the ways of Jesus. Rome was turned upside down by them. But not by a conquering hero, by humble servants who just loved people well and modeled the ways of Jesus and invited people to experience a transcendent kingdom. Here's the problem. That singular statement is anti-self-promotion. It's also anti-self-protection. It's anti-self-preservation. It's also anti-American. We follow a king who wore a cross and calls us to do the same. Andy Stanley wrote a book called Not In It to Win It, and he says it this way: any admonition that declares that we must rule should be checked with the immediate reminder that Christ did not. It is the cross, not the boardroom, not the Oval Office, and not the box office, that is the absolute center of the kingdom of God. Our faith is anchored to a miscarriage of justice. The worst possible thing happened to the best possible person. That's the Jesus that we follow. And it's hard for us to wrap our minds around that, because we live in the rugged individualism where you take what's yours and it's your job to go impose your will. And yet Jesus is saying, I've got something better. And I've turned the world upside down over the last 2,000 years, offering something better. And now you're trying to warp Christianity into something that I never intended it to be. And maybe there's a reason why we're seeing so many with a distaste for the Christian faith, because we're not living it authentically. Here's the deal. The Christian faith has in and of itself so many challenges for people, because there's so many things about the Christian faith where he's calling us to something different that are going to be deal breakers. Let's be careful that we're not manufacturing some that don't need to be there. Let's make sure that we're at least allowing people to decide it's a deal breaker for the right reasons, rather than because we're misrepresenting it from a power and an impositional position. Then the text jumps ahead. And Mark again, and you saw it last week, there's this juxtaposition in the text where Mark is showcasing something, and then he's showcasing something else, and he's saying, this is the same Jesus. This is the same Jesus. Don't miss the fact that these differences are still part of the same Jesus. And he jumps ahead, and the text reads us this way. It's the transfiguration, where a veil was momentarily lifted for Peter, James, and John to see the glory and the power and the authority of Jesus. Jesus has just said that some of you will not taste death until they see the Son of Man lifted up. Now, verse 2, we begin here. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. I can't even begin to put full words around this. I think Mark is trying to explain what Peter told him, and I think they're just trying to make sense out of what was experienced. But there's this glory on the top of a mountain where God's glory is being revealed at the top of a mountain. And Elijah and Moses and Jesus are all interacting with each other. Oh, to be a fly on that wall. And they got to see the glory of Jesus. Now, don't miss this. They're at the top of a mountain, and God is revealing his glory to these 3 men, and they're not killed. Why is that significant? Because when Moses said to God, I want to see your glory, what did God say? You can't, because if you see it, you'll be put to death. You can't survive that. So why is it that these guys get to see the glory of God revealed at the top of a mountain and Moses couldn't? What's the difference? Jesus is here. Jesus is the mediator. Jesus is the one that allows them to experience this without dying, because he is the one that allows us to experience the glory of God without suffering the full consequences of that, because he is the one who's offered us access. He's the mediator. The transfiguration was a foretaste of the end of the age, a glimpse behind the veil at the glory that Christ continued to immutably possess, even though it was hidden behind him as a humble servant. A picture of his unique power and authority. Look at verses 5 and 6. I love what Mark does. He gives us this little anecdote in verse 6. It says, Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Somehow there's this glory that's being revealed, and let's put up these tabernacles that are going to somehow allow us to worship more fully by putting up these tabernacles. And look at what it says in verse 6. Peter didn't know what to say because they were so frightened. Mark's like, yeah, it didn't make any sense that he said that because he had no idea what to say, so Peter just blurted it out. Which is what Peter does over and over again, right? Peter speaks without thinking, which is why I love him so much. God's glory is revealed, and they don't die. One of my favorite anecdotes this is me nerding out, which is okay. Indulge me for a minute. So Peter spent 3 years with Jesus, following Jesus, and got to see Jesus' teachings, got to see an unbelievable amount of miracles, at least 35, 36, they're documented in the text. Peter got to see all kinds of, beyond just those 35 or 36 specific, all these other ones that he did along the way. Peter talked about lots of different things. But do you know when Peter was writing his 2 letters, that he was sitting down to craft 2 letters to offer hope to persecuted Christians? Do you know that this moment in time was the only anecdote, only moment in his time with Jesus that Peter specifically speaks to? In 2 Peter 1, verse 17 and 18, it says this, he received honor and glory from God, the Father, when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, this is my Son, whom I love, with whom I am well pleased. We ourselves heard the voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountaintop. When Peter is writing to a group of Christians that he loves dearly, and he's trying to encourage them in the face of major opposition, there's only one story that Peter specifically identifies about what he experienced with Jesus, and it's this transfiguration. Why? Because there's something about what Peter experienced by the glory of Jesus being revealed as a snapshot of hope of who this Jesus fully was, even while now they're on the backside of Jesus being put put to death, rising again, and now ascending. Now they're trying to find hope in the midst of these, saying, no, I need you to understand. I saw his glory manifest. I saw that power in a very specific way. And we're told this in verse 9. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came of the cloud, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, there was no longer anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone until they had seen the Son of Man risen from the dead. Don't talk about this. Which I would imagine the disciples are you kidding me? They're coming down the mountain. They're like ready to share this as soon as possible. At least with the other disciples, if not everybody else. And they're like, no. Jesus says, I want you to wait till after you see the Son of Man risen. And then you can share it. Because this is a snapshot of coming glory. D.A. Carson, he's reflecting on this passage on the Transfiguration. He says it this way. One of the great failures into which even believers sometimes fall is the tendency to underestimate Jesus. Jesus has no rivals. There are many religious leaders in an age of postmodern sensibilities and a deep cultural commitment to philosophical pluralism. It is desperately easy to relativize Jesus in countless ways. But there is only one person of whom it can be said that he made us, then he became one of us, that he is the Lord of glory and a human being, that he died in ignominy and shame on the odious cross, yet it now seated on the right hand of the majesty on high, having returned to the glory he shared with the Father before the world began. We need to be careful that we don't underestimate who this Jesus is. We don't understand him. He doesn't fit into our categories. It's hard for us to understand why he does what he does and why he calls us to certain things and why does he allow me to experience certain desires and certain things and then calls me to not to align myself with them or not to pursue them. Why does he operate the way he does? Why does he allow me to get hurt the way he does and then calls me to forgive others and to walk in a humble, gracious manner in the face of that opposition? Why does he keep calling me forward even though I've been so deeply wounded? Why does he want that? Only if he is who he says he is does he have a right to do that. Only if he is indeed the one who created us, the one who redeemed us, and the one who holds everything together around us. While many may choose to doubt the legitimacy of Jesus as Savior and divine, he left no question regarding the authority, the power, and the glory he possessed. People are going to, that's fine. Like people are going to question him. People are going to dismiss him. People are going to wonder, can he really be divine and human? Is that really even a thing? There's all kinds of skepticism. I respect that. I understand why people would push back and why circumstances of life would lead me to question and wonder if God is really good. All of that's legit. All I would say is this. In Jesus' ministry and what he's presented to us, he left no question. He didn't leave this open-ended. He established that he is one with God, that we've seen him, we've seen the Father, and that no one comes to the Father except through him. And then he showcases his authority. He showcases his power, and he showcased his glory to leave us no excuse. We still may question. Many will still deny. But he did it differently. And he showcased that power over and over and over again. Let's just kind of reflect for a moment on the differences between the expected Messiah and who the Son of Man is that Jesus came to showcase. The expected Messiah was supposed to be an insurrectionist. He was going to come in and he was going to do something radically different. He was going to upset everything. He was going to acquire power and then leverage it for personal gain and advancement. He was going to enter Jerusalem on a war horse, a conquering hero. He was going to march on Rome as a conquering hero, and he was going to establish his earthly kingdom, leaving no question and no doubt that he was finally the Davidic king, the rightful heir to the throne. That was what was expected of Jesus. That's the expected Messiah. So what did we get instead? We got the Son of Man. The Son of Man was not an insurrectionist, but he was a revolutionary. He did upset things. He radically changed our understanding of humility. Humility for us today is something that somebody humbles themselves. Up until Jesus, humility was not something you did to yourself. Humility was something somebody did to you. Somebody humbled you. You didn't do it to yourself. He was a revolutionary where he reestablished what is greatness, redefined love. He harnessed power to allow himself to be assassinated. He entered Jerusalem not on a war horse, but on a donkey. He didn't march on Rome. He walked into Rome as a lamb led to slaughter. He established an earthly kingdom? Nope. He established a heavenly kingdom on earth that is right here in our midst, and it's not fully realized yet, which is why we live in this tension of the brokenness of humanity and the painful realities that make us wonder if this is a deal breaker for us, because we keep waiting for the fulfillment to finally get here. But as we look at that thing, this is what the disciples, the first century believers were anticipating. This is what they got. For us, I think there's similarities. We expect Jesus to be the one who always answers our prayers. We expect in the way that we want him to. We expect Jesus to be the one who does things in a way that makes sense to us. We expect Jesus to be the one that doesn't allow us to suffer significant losses, that doesn't allow other people to betray us and violate us. We expect Jesus to guard and protect us against that. He's supposed to be a force field that's going to keep all those things from us. If he loves us, he wouldn't allow those things to happen to us. And yet Jesus is the Son of Man, who will one day return as a conquering hero and make everything right. But that's not how he came the first time. And we worship him in anticipation of what he will do, but we also worship him because of what he's already done and how he did come the first time. So I just want to invite us to consider this as we close. How do you decide whether something's going to be a deal breaker or a life changer for you? Because I know in this room, some of us are wrestling with that right now. Some of you have been through stuff recently where you're asking the question, is this a deal breaker or a game changer for me? And if you haven't recently, it's coming. It's coming. You're going to have something. You're going to have a moment. You're going to have a situation. You're going to experience something where you're going to ask the question, is this a deal breaker? Can I really trust God? Can I trust that he is good? Can I trust his plan? Or is this a game changer? Does this force me to have to deal with this differently? Jesus will unapologetically fail to meet all of our expectations and desires. He unapologetically will not meet all of our expectations and desires. Do you know why? Do you know why, by the way? There's two simple reasons. Number one, his ways are not our ways, his thoughts are not our thoughts. And number two, mine are too selfish and too self-serving. So he sees things differently and has a different perspective and has a greater concern for what's happening in this world than just my desires. And I can't divorce myself from my own selfish aspirations. So I can think of myself as altruistic and I want the best for everybody else, and yet I'm still looking at it through my own limited lens of what I think things should look like. He's going to fail unapologetically to meet our expectations and desires. Does that make him more or less trustworthy and worthy of all of our worship? That's the question. If he doesn't meet my expectations, is he now less trustworthy? Or is he more trustworthy? Can I worship him more fully because I don't fully understand him, or I have to fully understand him so I can worship him? And let me explain this. Let me say this. If I fully understand God, he's not worthy of worship. Because if I can fully understand him, then I can make full sense out of him. I can make full sense out of him that he is finite and within my grasp. And if God is within my grasp, then he's not greater than me. And if he's not greater than me, he doesn't stand outside of me, then I can't worship him. He is not trustworthy. To what degree will I trust that my expectations and desires will determine what should be? To what degree am I going to allow my expectations and my desires to determine what I think things should look like? Because to the degree that I decide that I have the right to determine what things should look like and how they should be, that's the degree to which it's always going to be a deal breaker. It's going to be a deal breaker every time as long as I get to be the one to determine that. It becomes a game changer when I let him be the one. It becomes a game changer when I'm willing to say, God, I don't understand it. I can't make sense out of it. You are not what I expect you to be. Jesus is calling me to something that is so hard for me. It breaks my heart. I'm grieving it. I may grieve it every day for the next foreseeable future, but here's what I know. He's worthy of my worship. He's worthy of my trust. I'm going to follow him. I'm going to respond to his calling. Because otherwise, what I'm deciding is that I know better. I have a better plan. And I'll be honest with you, spend enough time pursuing your own aspirations and your own plans, you will come to the realization that you have created your own catastrophic reality. Because it will never offer you what you're looking for. Would you stand together, please?